Good morning, church. I hope you are all doing well. If you want to follow along in your Bibles, whether it's physical, on your phone, or in your photographic memory, we're going to be in Exodus 16 today. And while you're getting there, I just want to say, wasn't last weekend so great? I was not, unfortunately, able to attend on Saturday due to work, but I heard great things from my wonderful wife and from so many of you. And then just being here on Sunday with Dr. McKinney. I know you all call him Phil. I have had him as a graduate professor, so I cannot bring myself to call him by his first name. But it was so great to just be with Dr. McKinney, and I'm very excited for the weeks to come as we dive into what it means to embark on the path of discipleship together. And my hope is that as we spend the next few weeks going through the book of Exodus, that will be able to tie into the theme as well. We're picking up in Exodus 16 today. To give you a little bit of a recap of where we are, is that the Israelites have just come out of the land of Egypt. And if you can remember from Exodus 14, that as they were at the Red Sea, ready to escape slavery, they turned back and they saw the chariots of Egypt coming to hunt them down. And their immediate response, after witnessing all the miraculous powers and signs that God has showed, their immediate response was, didn't we tell Moses it would have been better to stay in Egypt as slaves? You know, they looked at all these great signs and they saw the chariots and wanted to return back to Egypt. Yet God parted the seas, led them to safety, and continued to demonstrate his power time and time again to them. And they entered into the wilderness. In Exodus 15, we're given this beautiful song by Miriam and by Moses, just detailing all of the wonderful ways God has worked in them. And then they reach another challenge. They find themselves in the desert. They find themselves without water. And they come to this place. They come to this spring that's given the name Mara. And if you remember from the book of Ruth, that means bitter. And they're complaining to Moses again, we can't drink this water. It's too bitter. How are we able to survive out here? And God, yet again, provides for them a clean source of water so that they can continue on in their journey. And it's here in Exodus 16, beginning in verse 2, that we find ourselves. They've ventured out into the wilderness further. And in verse 2, it says, the entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us into this wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to rain bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. This way, I will test them to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on other days. So the Israelites, the whole community, they find themselves in the wilderness. There's no food to eat. And once again, they are complaining to Moses and they're complaining to Aaron that it would have been better for them to have stayed and to have died in Egypt. Because even though they were under the bondage of slavery to Pharaoh, at least they had pots of meat and food to eat, right? Like they were willing to trade food for slavery. And even though they're now free in the wilderness, why have Moses brought them out here to starve and to die? And if I'm being completely candid, I find that very, very relatable. I remember once upon a time, I would read scripture and I would really try to identify with the heroes of the passage, right? Well, I need to be Moses, or I need to be like David, or I need to be like X, Y, or Z. But as I've gotten older and I read through these texts and I read through the complaining Israelites, or if the Gospels and I read through the dumbfounded disciples in the New Testament, I find myself thinking I'm not too far off from them. Because if I'm being honest with you, church, I, in my own life, really struggle with uncertainty. I'm a planner by nature, and I want to give you two illustrations to show you what I do in the face of uncertainty. One is in my particular industry, January is the slowest month every single year. It's not uncommon for me to go days without talking to a potential customer. I mean, it's slow. And when things are slow at work, I completely reorder and reorganize and rearrange my entire working space. I move my computer from this side to this side. I move my cabinet to over there. I readjust what pictures I have on display. I change keyboard mats. I change everything. That way I can have a sense of control when I don't know what's going to happen that day. I struggle with uncertainty. Another example is a couple of weeks ago, Taylor and I were out to lunch and we were just talking about the future. And I went on a little bit of a rant and I said, well, if this happens, this will mean A, B, or C. And if this doesn't happen, that's going to mean X, Y, or Z. And if it means X, then that's going to mean 1, 2, or 3. And Taylor basically said to me in very kind words, just stop talking. We'll take it a day at a time and we'll pray about it. But I personally struggle with uncertainty. I've often joked that I have to have a plan. Things can deviate from the plan, but I at least have to have a plan because I need a sense of order. I need a sense of certainty for what lies ahead. And maybe some of you, I really identify with that. Some of you may be, I'm a complete free spirit. I go one day at a time, whichever the ways the winds will blow, I'll just wait and see. But maybe it's not planning ahead for the future that we struggle with. Maybe it's concerns about our finances, right? Maybe it's we are anxious and concerned about what the next week might bring financially. And so we want to harbor what we have coming and we want to be protective of it like Smaug the dragon from The Hobbit, right? We want to just make sure that this stays with us. Or maybe when we think about what it means to follow Christ, we get anxious about what that means for our daily lives. Like what, if I'm going to fully commit to following God, what does that mean for me in my workplace relationships? What does that mean for me growing in my career? You know, maybe my career calls for someone to be cutthroat and ruthless, but what does that mean for me if I'm going to follow God? And we start asking these questions that go along the lines of what if, right? What if? And we're playing defense. We're so concerned about whether it's the future, the finances, our relationships, whatever it is, you name it, that we start asking, well, what if this happens? I need to respond preemptively so I don't get hurt, or I don't get left out to dry, or I don't get burned. And when we get into playing that game and we get into that mode, it reminds me of when we get stuck in quicksand. I have a picture of it up here. You may not be able to read the sign. It says quicksand. Now, if I'm being fully honest, I thought as a child, every book and movie I read or watched as a kid had something to do with quicksand. And so I thought encountering quicksand would be a much more common problem in my adult life than it has been. I can safely say I have not yet encountered quicksand once in my life. But everything I've learned from Scooby-Doo and from every other movie or book that deals with quicksand is that if you fall into it and you struggle and fight to get out of it, you just end up sinking faster. The quicksand begins to overtake you. And it's only when you calm yourself and you settle yourself down that you can rely on help from others to escape from the quicksand. But when you try to struggle and work at it on your own power and on your own strength, you only sink faster. And I know for me, when I start to over plan for what is coming ahead and I try to force a plan into action, it only makes me more stressed and anxious and irritable and unpleasant to be around, and I begin to rely in my own strength. The good news is that we are not the first people to ever struggle with this. We're not the first people to ever ask, what if, and to be caught in that cycle of trying to figure our own way out of this problem. Because as we've seen, the Israelites are here too. They've come into the desert. They find themselves no food, and they start looking to one another saying, what if we don't find any food anytime soon? We're going to die here. And if we're going to die, we might as well have died back in Egypt where at least we had food. And they begin this train of thought that leads them into grumbling and complaining about Moses. And this is where I have to admire the patience of Moses, because I think I don't know, I would have been like, didn't you see what God did with the plagues? And didn't you see what he did with parting the sea? I mean, literal walls of water. Didn't you see all that? He just gave us clean water a few days ago. Why are you complaining about lack of food? And yet God tells Moses that he is going to bring down bread from heaven, and he is going to bring them quail. And so again, I want to pick up in verse 6, and we'll read on a little bit further here. Verse 6, where it says, so Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, this evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the Lord's glory, because he has heard your complaints about him. For who are we that you complained about us? Moses continued. The Lord will give you meat to eat this evening, and all the bread you want in the morning. For he has heard the complaints that you are raising against him. Who are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord. And so God then sends them quail in the evening to get the sustenance to eat. He brings down manna from heaven, what the Israelites call this bread from heaven that rises in the morning, and they collect it. And he gives them the command that on days 1 through 6, days 1 through 5, to go out and collect what you need for the day. And on the 6th day, what you bring in, what you harvest will be enough for both today and tomorrow, because tomorrow is the Sabbath, and we rest on Sabbath, and there will not be quail and manna brought to you on the Sabbath. And he continues to give them these ideas that are reinforcing this idea that they need to trust in him. Because if they try to overgather, it's not going to last. Picking up again in verse 21. In verse 17. So the Israelites did this. Some gathered a lot, some a little. And when they measured it by quarts, the person who had gathered a lot had no surplus, and the person who gathered a little had no shortage. Each gathered as much as he needed to eat. Moses said to them, no one is to let any of it remain until morning. But they didn't listen to Moses. Some people left part of it until morning, and it bred worms, and part of it and stank. Therefore, Moses was angry with them. They gathered it every morning. Each gathered as much as he needed to eat, but when the sun grew hot, it melted. And on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much food, 4 quarts apiece, and all the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He told them, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a day of complete rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, and set aside everything left over to be kept until morning. So they set it aside until morning as Moses commanded, and it didn't stink or have maggots on it. Eat it today, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you won't find any in the field. For 6 days you will gather, but on the 7th day the Sabbath, there will be none. Again, I find this passage with the Israelites, for me personally, to be very relatable. They've gone out, they've gathered, and those who seem to have gathered a lot, they didn't have surplus. They didn't have extra overflowing. And those who only gathered a little also had enough for them. And yet there were some who, instead of eating their fill for the day, and this is candidly, I truly believe this is what, in their shoes, what I would have done, is they gathered for the day, and then they start playing, but what if there isn't more tomorrow? What if the manna doesn't come back again? Let me set aside some of this just in case. And in the morning comes and they go to open up this bread from heaven, this manna, and there it is, rotten and filled with worms. God continued to provide for them. They didn't have to worry if there was going to be enough for tomorrow because God, time and time again, was sending them the manna and the quail to provide for them. Then they get the instruction that on the sixth day to gather what they need, to boil and to bake it. For on the seventh day, on the Sabbath, the day of rest, the day in recognition of the Lord and what he has done for them, there will be none. And it's here that we continue in verse 27, that yet on the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they did not find any. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and instructions? Understand that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he will give you 2 days' worth of bread. Each of you stay where you are. No one is to leave his place on the seventh day." So the people rested on the seventh day. Again, this dangerous game of what if. On the seventh day comes, they've baked, they've boiled, they should have plenty, they should be ready for the day of rest. Yet some in the camp say, yeah, but just what if it doesn't last? Let's go out and look anyways. You know, it's happened 6 days in a row. Surely there's going to be on 7. Let's play it safe. We're better safe than sorry, and let's go back out into the fields to look for the quail and for the manna. And it's here that they find none, and God is speaking to Moses. It's like, how long are they going to keep disobeying me? You know, how many times are they going to put their faith and their trust in something else other than me? Because time and time again, as they've left out of Egypt, I have showed them my strength and my trust and my power and my sustenance for them. And for 40 years, I have not been on earth for 40 years. This has been my 28th winter. For 40 years, the Israelites walked through the wilderness, eating manna and quail day by day. And I have to imagine that by the end of the 40th year, that most of them understood that for 6 days, God is going to provide us food. God is going to he's not going to let us starve. And that on the sixth day, we will gather and we will bake and we will boil. And on the Sabbath, when there is no new manna and there is no new quail, we will still be provided for. But I also have to imagine that there were still some who let their concerns get the best of them, who let their worries and their anxieties and their concerns, their uneasiness about this journey ahead of them get the best, and they searched for more manna on the seventh day, or they harbored more and only to see it rot again in the morning. Because laying down our concerns, it's hard to do. And we know this because this is not the only time in Scripture where God is giving people a command or a lesson to not worry, that God, and reinforcing that God is going to provide for them. In Matthew chapter 6, in verse 25, Jesus is teaching, he's on the Sermon on the Mount, and he's talking to all those who are crowded before them. And he's just talked to them about their treasures, their possessions, to not store up possessions on earth. And he launches into this. He says, beginning in verse 25, he says, "Therefore, I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Isn't life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Consider the birds of the sky. They don't sow or reap or gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Aren't you worth more than they? Can any of you add 1 moment to his lifespan by worrying? And why do you worry about clothes? Observe how the wildflowers of the field grow. They don't labor or spendthread. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was adorned like one of these. If that's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and thrown into the furnace tomorrow, won't he do much more for you, you of little faith? So don't worry, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear? For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, and your heavenly fathers know that you need them. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you. Therefore, don't worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Thousands of years later, after the Israelites were able to settle in the promised land and kings came and kings went, Jesus is in the scene and he is still having to teach and having to tell the people of God that God has not forgotten them and that God is going to provide for them and that God is going to take care of them. And here we are 2,000 years later, and that's a lesson that we still need to soak in, that we still need to fully embrace. In Proverbs 19, I have it on the next slide here. Proverbs 19, verse 21, the author says, many plans are in a person's heart, but the Lord's decree will prevail. When we think about embarking upon this path of discipleship, one of the hardest things about it is willingly giving up control of our own lives and being willing to go wherever God is going to take us. If I can be fully transparent and candid with you, church, I never set out in my life to be a car salesman. You know, as a kid, that's not what I dreamed of. I didn't wake up one day like I want to sell Chevrolet vehicles, 5 days a week, every Saturday. And like, that's not what I wanted to set out to be. And yet God, I think, has worked through me and my family being here. And even though this isn't maybe what I thought it would be, I think there has been some good that has come from that. Thursday, I drove up to Boston. One of the missionaries who I interned with a decade ago, which makes me feel old, a decade ago is now based out of Boston. And him and I were getting lunch, and we were just talking about life. And I remember asking him, I don't want to be a car salesman for the rest of my life. And I'm frustrated because I want to figure out what is going to come next. But how do I figure out when we have a young family? And I start getting into the thing where I did with Taylor, like, if this or that happens, does it mean A, B, C, X, Y, Z? And he says, just take it easy. He said, you and I are a lot alike. But he's in his mid-40s now. He said, but looking back on his life where he's gone from Colorado to North Little Rock, to Portugal, to Angola, and now in Boston. He said, this is not where I thought life was going to take me either. But God is working through it. We just only have to submit. We only have to trust in him. So as we move forward, what I want you to do is I want you to take a moment and to think about it, or if you're more of a writer, to write this down. But when you think about fully committing yourself to God and fully saying, I'm going to follow this path of discipleship, I'm going to follow in the path of Jesus Christ, and that is going to take me where it will, I want you to think about what your first but is, or your first but what if is. And I want you to dwell on that. And I don't mean that in the way like, I should feel bad because this is my what if, but just what is your but? What if this doesn't happen? Or what if this does happen? And that's a scary thing, because what we're here to do as a church is to help one another on this journey. I'd like to say that discipleship is not a single adventure, right? It's not something for the lone wolf, but it's something that we are doing in community together, that we're doing in partnership with one another, because I'm going to have my shortcomings, but I'm also going to have my strengths. And maybe in my shortcomings, you have the strength to help me, right? Maybe you are much more content with being in the place and the time than I am, and you can help ground me. And when you're going to have stuff where you're anxious and stressed and worried and wondering, what does this mean for my life? Maybe I'll be able there to help you too. And in all our other blind spots and weaknesses, there is going to be someone else that God has raised up in this church who can help us with that. Because what I want us to do as we embark on this path of discipleship is, instead of asking the question of what if, is start to think through the idea of imagine if. Imagine if we all were able to put aside our big strengths and fully submit to God. Imagine if we as a church were willing to fully submit to whatever God's plan has been. I think it's easy to say that there have been some wonderful things over the past several months. We've had Tashima join us, who's working with us in ministry. Randall joined us part-time and is now working with us full-time so he can fully invest in our teens and their families and his congregation. We have Dr. McKinney, who you call Phil, but I can't bring myself to. Dr. McKinney, who is joining us 3 times in person and every Wednesday for the next 10 or so weeks to help guide us upon this journey, because we have been willing to submit to what God is doing. We called it, I think, the 3-pronged approach. That is something new. And if I can again be candid with you, when I first heard the news, I was skeptical. Like, if I'm being fully honest, I was skeptical because this was something different. It was not something I had heard of, but I wanted to see it through. And I think God is doing something wonderful through it. So if we can, as a church, stop saying, but what if this happens? Or what if this doesn't happen? And start saying, imagine if. Where is God going to take us next? And that's true for both us as a body and us as individuals. Obviously, my hope is that we will all be here in Manchester together for years and years and years to come, and we'll be able to make deep, deep roots together as a family as we spread into our communities. But maybe God is going to take you and your family elsewhere into the country or world. Connecticut's the 5th state I've lived in. I'm 27, so that's one state approximately every 5.3 years. We don't know where God is going to take us. But imagine if we just say, I'm not going to let my hangups about the future, I'm not going to let my hangups about money and finance, I'm not going to let my hangups about what does this mean for me in the workplace get in the way of committing to God. If you, as an individual, want to take that step, I loved what Dr. McKinney showed on Wednesday. I think he showed it on Saturday, but Wednesday, where he showed the spiritual growth process. We're all in different stages, and that's good. That's healthy. We're moving together. If you're a spiritual infant and you've been wanting to know more about God and you're ready to take that commitment, the water is ready. There's elders and there's deacons and there's all sorts of people who are ready to help you along this journey. Or if you're somewhere into spiritual adolescence or adulthood or maturity, but you are wrestling and you need help saying, I have this stressor in my life. How do I help move through it? Again, there are brothers and sisters here who can help you out. And if you have a dream for what we can do as a church and how we as a church can fully trust in God and we can move forward, again, there are people here who want to hear that and help you put it into action. So if you have any need or any way that the church can help you as an individual, I encourage you to come forward as we stand and as we sing.